Number 6. A glimpse into the wardrobe of power. You might think fashion's wildest moments belong to our modern age, with runway shows featuring dresses made of bubble wrap or shoes that defy gravity. But what if I told you that centuries ago, in the gilded halls of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, clothing choices were so extreme, so unbelievably impractical, that they make today's wildest outfits look like pajamas? Forget your skinny jeans or your oversized hoodies. The Habsburg court, a family line that ruled vast swaths of Europe for centuries, including mighty Austria and Spain, wasn't just about power and politics. It was a factory of fashion trends so utterly bizarre, so ridiculously demanding, they bordered on performance art. Life in the Habsburg palaces was a constant costume drama, where every stitch, every layer, every towering accessory screamed status, discipline, and a profound disregard for comfort or common sense. These weren't just clothes. They were architectural marvels, instruments of social control, and sometimes literal traps. Imagine navigating your day, eating your meals, conducting your diplomacy, all while trussed up in something that resembled a walking, talking art installation. These 5 trends, popularized by the Habsburgs and their endless pursuit of grandeur, were more than just fleeting fads. They were a way of life, forcing courtiers and even the emperors and empresses themselves into contortions and discomforts that are truly astonishing to behold. Prepare yourself for a journey back in time where dignity was measured not by ease of movement, but by the sheer absurdity of your attire. Number 5. The unyielding embrace of the great Ruff. Picture this. It's the late 16th century, and you're a noble at the Habsburg court in Vienna or Madrid. You're expected to present yourself with utmost dignity and a certain impenetrable formality. And nothing, absolutely nothing, conveyed that sense of rigid authority quite like the great Ruff. This wasn't your dainty little ruffled collar that peeked out from a shirt. Oh no. The great Ruff was a monstrous starched disc that encircled the neck, often extending outwards for a foot or more, resembling a giant pleated fan or a pristine white satellite dish. It was a fashion statement that literally distanced you from everyone else. The creation of a great ruff was an art in itself. It was typically made from fine linen, though later versions might incorporate lace, and it required an incredible amount of meticulous labor. Yards and yards of fabric were folded, pleated, and then heavily starched. Imagine the smell of all that starch, the crispness that felt like thin armor. Once starched, the ruff had to be painstakingly shaped, using specialized tools, often hot irons or goffering irons, to create its characteristic, even pleats. Some ruffs could have hundreds of pleats, each one perfectly identical. To maintain its rigid form, especially a ruff of grand proportions, it often needed a supportive framework underneath, a hidden wire structure called a supportas or piccadilly. Without this, the ruff would simply collapse under its own weight, a crumpled, deflated symbol of sartorial failure. Wearing the great ruff was a daily trial. It was not merely uncomfortable. It was a physical barrier. If you wanted to look to your left or right, you had to rotate your entire upper body. This gave the wearer a certain statuesque quality, an almost robotic stillness that was perhaps intentional. It certainly made eye contact a carefully orchestrated affair. Speaking with someone required you to face them directly, chin slightly lifted, as if you were forever posing for a portrait. Any subtle nod or shake of the head was simply impossible. Eating was another monumental challenge. Imagine trying to bring a spoonful of broth to your lips when a starched barricade stands between your mouth and the bowl. Special, long-handled spoons were sometimes employed, but even then spilled food was a constant hazard, staining the pristine white linen and instantly ruining the carefully constructed garment. Drinking from a cup required an even more awkward maneuver, often involving tilting the head back at an unnatural angle, or using a straw-like device. Conversations over a meal would have been punctuated by the clinking of cutlery against the stiff fabric and the quiet rustle of shifting positions. The Habsburg emperors, known for their strict court etiquette, were no exception. Emperor Rudolf II, a known patron of the arts and sciences, would have presided over his court in such a collar. His movements, precise and deliberate, constrained by the very symbol of his authority. Beyond the dinner table, the Ruff dictated every aspect of movement. Bowing, a frequent necessity in courtly life, became a precarious act. A deep bow might mean the Ruff scraping against the chin, or even dislodging its carefully placed pleats. Dancing, if attempted, would have been a stiff formal affair, with partners maintaining a polite distance to avoid colliding with each other's formidable neckwear. Entering doorways became a strategic maneuver, requiring the wearer to turn sideways, careful not to snag the delicate pleats on the doorframe. Sleeping in a ruff was, thankfully, not a requirement, but the process of carefully removing it and storing it so it wouldn't lose its shape was another daily ritual. The social implications of the great ruff were profound. It was a clear indicator of wealth. Only those with sufficient means could afford the fine linen, the extensive labor for its creation, and the dedicated servants required for its daily maintenance, which often included specialized laundering and restarch. A soiled or crumpled ruff would have been a public humiliation. It also acted as a physical representation of the social hierarchy, literally separating the nobility from the common folk. Those without the rank or wealth to wear a ruff would have been kept at a respectful distance, visually and physically. The sheer impracticality of it all underscored the wearer's elevated status. They were so important, so removed from manual labor, that they could afford to wear something that hindered basic human functions. This was not a garment designed for comfort or utility. It was designed for display, for grandeur, for establishing an undeniable presence. And it worked. The great ruff, in all its starched, unyielding glory, remains one of history's most striking and undeniably ridiculous fashion statements, making every Habsburg courtier a walking, breathing monument to formality. Number 4. The sprawling domain of the Farthingale and Panier. If the great ruff controlled the neck, then the Farthingale and later the Panier took over the entire lower body, creating a fashion silhouette that defied gravity and logical spatial reasoning. These were not simply wide skirts. They were architectural constructions designed to inflate the dress to colossal proportions, turning the wearer into a mobile, bell-shaped or table-like structure. The effect was undeniably grand, but the practical implications were nothing short of absurd. The Farthingale, which originated in Spain, the cradle of many Habsburg fashion, trends began as a conical framework made of hoops of willow, cane, or whalebone. Sewn into a petticoat, this structure worn underneath the skirt gave it a rigid, bell-like shape. Think of a giant lampshade around the wearer's waist. As the 16th century progressed, and with it the influence of the Spanish Habsburgs, the Farthingale grew in size. By the late 1500s, especially in the courts of Philip II and Philip III, the Farthingale could create a skirt circumference that measured several yards. The Infanta Maria Theresa, future Empress of Austria and consort to Louis XIV, was often depicted in Velasquez's portraits, wearing such a garment even as a child or tiny child. By the 18th century, the fashion evolved into the Panier, a French term meaning basket. Unlike the conical Farthingale, which flared out all around, the Panier pushed the skirts out dramatically at the sides, often leaving the front and back relatively flat. This created a horizontal oval shape, a flattened disc around the waist, making the wearer astonishingly wide. Some panniers were so wide they resembled small tables, truly living up to their basket name. These frames were often made of lightweight willow or cane hoops, connected by tapes or fabric, designed to collapse slightly for easier passage through doorways. Though even that was a challenge. Empress Maria Theresa, a formidable ruler of the Habsburg monarchy, would have worn dresses expanded by these panniers, navigating the vast ruins of Schönbrunn Palace as a woman of immense horizontal presence. The sheer scale of these garments made even simple movements a complicated ballet. Sitting down required a special technique, often involving a wide chair or bench. The wearer could not simply lower themselves. They had to perch on the edge or lean back, their skirt enveloping the seat like a tent. Standing up from such a seated position would have been an equally graceful feat, requiring a shift of weight and a gentle sway. Navigating corridors and doorways was a constant spatial puzzle. Imagine a group of Habsburg ladies, each encased in their expansive panniers, trying to move through a crowded room or a narrow passage. It would have been a slow, deliberate procession, with frequent polite bumps and maneuvers to avoid snagging on furniture or other people. Dancing, a popular courtly pastime, became a highly structured event. While some dances might allow for the skirt to sway, others would have required partners to maintain a considerable distance, their movements restricted by the sheer width of their attire. The stately minuets and sarabands of the era suited the limited mobility these garments allowed. Imagine a lady trying to curtsy deeply. The massive skirt would brush the floor, making a delicate fluid motion impossible. Instead, it was a stiff, controlled dip. Beyond court functions, daily life was a series of minor struggles. Getting into a carriage was a logistical nightmare, often requiring special wide doors or the wearer to enter sideways, their dress consuming most of the interior. Even simple acts like bending down to pick something up were impossible without assistance or an undignified struggle. The weight of the multiple layers of petticoats and the outer gown, combined with a rigid framework, meant that wearing such attire for hours on end was physically exhausting. Courtiers would have been perpetually warm, encased in layers of heavy silk, velvet, or brocade. Especially during the summer months, in un-air-conditioned palaces. The symbolism of the Farthingale and Paniers was clear. They were a display of wealth, power, and the wearers removed from any form of manual labor. Only those with ample space servants to assist them, and no need to perform practical tasks, could afford to be so spatially extravagant. The sheer amount of fabric required for such dresses was enormous, costing a fortune, and the specialized tailors and seamstresses needed to construct these complex garments were highly skilled. A lady's dress was not just a piece of clothing, it was a movable architectural statement, a testament to her family's status and influence within the rigid hierarchy of the Habsburg court. The Farthingale and Panier transformed the human form into an almost abstract shape, a walking monument to fashion's most outrageous and utterly impractical desires. Number 3. The mighty mountain of Austrian puffs. While other European courts embraced ruffs and farthingales, the Habsburgs, with their distinctive flair for elaborate and often restrictive fashion, also championed the Schlauchärmel, or Austrian puffs. These were not just puffed sleeves, they were colossal balloon-like structures that transformed the arms into veritable mountains of fabric, giving the wearer an almost inhuman breadth, and making everyday gestures a formidable challenge. Popular from the early to mid-17th century, these sleeves truly defined a unique and undeniably ridiculous silhouette. Imagine a sleeve so large, so round, that it resembled a fully inflated balloon attached at the shoulder, tapering slightly towards the wrist. These sleeves were often constructed with internal padding or stiffening, sometimes even a light wire frame to maintain their voluminous shape. They were typically made from rich, heavy fabrics, like velvet, brocade, or silk, often in vibrant colors, contrasting with the main body of the gown. The sheer quantity of fabric required for just one pair of these sleeves was staggering. A single sleeve could consume several yards of material, making the garment incredibly costly and heavy. Wearing the Austrian puffs meant sacrificing most natural arm movements. Raising one's arms above the shoulder would have been an almost impossible feat, the enormous puffs bumping against the head or the surrounding environment. Gesturing in conversation became a stiff, constrained affair. A casual wave or an expansive sweep of the arm was out of the question. Instead, movements were limited to a more contained, almost regal style, with hands often clasped in front or resting demurely. This forced elegance, this constrained posture, was likely intentional, reinforcing the wearer's status and their removal from any form of physical labor. Consider the daily challenges. Reaching for an object on a high shelf, forget about it. Even picking up something from a table could be tricky, requiring the wearer to bend from the waist rather than extend their arm naturally. Sitting in a chair with armrests would have been a tight squeeze, the massive sleeves pressing uncomfortably against the sides. Passing through doorways or navigating crowded rooms meant constantly being aware of the circumference of one's sleeves, lest they snag on a passerby or a piece of furniture. It was a constant exercise in spatial awareness, turning simple movements into a conscious negotiation with one's own attire. Dining with these sleeves would have presented its own unique set of difficulties. Bringing cutlery to the mouth or a cup to the lips without brushing against the enormous fabric was a delicate operation. One can only imagine the stains that might have accumulated on the inner surfaces of those grand sleeves over the course of a lavish Habsburg banquet. A lady attempting to sip from a wine glass might find her sleeve dipping into the contents if she wasn't careful. The Austrian puffs also added significant weight to the already heavy court gowns. Wearing such an ensemble for hours, attending court functions, receiving visitors, or participating in ceremonial events would have been physically draining. The constant drag of the fabric, the restricted movement, and the sheer heat generated by layers of heavy material would have tested the endurance of even the most stoic. Habsburg noble, but comfort was not the goal. These sleeves were a potent visual symbol of wealth and social standing. The cost of the fabrics, the skill of the tailors required to construct these intricate padded forms, and the sheer impracticality of the design all screamed luxury. Only those who had no need to use their arms for practical tasks, those who were waited upon hand and foot, could afford to wear such a garment. The bigger the puff, the greater the display of affluence and idleness. The distinctiveness of the Austrian puffs helped to define the Habsburg court's unique fashion identity during this period, differentiating them from their French, English, or Italian counterparts. It was a statement of power and distinctiveness, asserting their own aesthetic dominance. In their exaggerated bulk and their restrictive nature, the Austrian puffs stand as a testament to a time when fashion was not just about adornment, but about literally reshaping the human form into something grand, imposing, and undeniably comically. Number 2. The stifling dignity of the Spanish black. When one thinks of Habsburg fashion, particularly in the 16th and early 17th centuries, an overwhelming sense of black, austere, and rigidly formal attire comes to mind. This wasn't just a preference for a dark color. It was a dominant court style known as the Spanish black, and it permeated the entire Habsburg dynasty, including its Austrian branch, transforming court life into a somber, unyielding display of power and piety. While perhaps not ridiculous in the same flamboyant way as enormous ruffs or skirts, its sheer restrictiveness, discomfort, and the psychological impact of its pervasive darkness make it profoundly noteworthy. And in its own way, quite extreme, the Spanish black style was championed by King Philip II of Spain, a fervent Catholic and a monarch who believed in displaying his piety and gravity through his clothing. Black, previously associated with mourning or scholarly pursuits, became the color of power, discipline, and unwavering orthodoxy. Under his reign, this wasn't just any black. It was a deep, rich, often lustrous black, achieved through complex and expensive dyeing processes. The fabric was typically heavy, velvet, silk, or brocade, adding to the garment's formidable presence. But the Spanish black was about more than just color. It was defined by its rigid construction and minimal adornment. Men wore tightly fitted doublets, often with stiff collars that almost touched their ears, paired with padded breeches and hose. Women's gowns were equally structured with tightly laced bodices that flattened the torso and long, voluminous skirts, often supported by farthingales, as discussed earlier. The necklines were typically high, sometimes extending into stiff standing collars. Sleeves were often long and fitted or moderately puffed, but always constructed to maintain a formal, unyielding shape. The discomfort was inherent in the design. The tight lacing of bodices, sometimes laced so tightly that breathing became shallow, was a constant reality for noblewomen. This practice, intended to create a desirable silhouette, could lead to fainting spells, indigestion, and general physical distress. The heavy fabrics, often worn in multiple layers, made these garments incredibly hot, particularly in the warmer months or in crowded court settings. Imagine attending a lengthy court ceremony standing for hours in a heavy velvet gown, stiflingly hot and unable to take a deep breath. Movement was severely restricted. The stiff collars, the rigid bodices, and the heavy skirts meant that natural fluid motion was impossible. Every gesture, every step was deliberate and controlled. This forced dignity contributed to the aura of solemnity and power that the Habsburgs wished to project. A courtier, in a Spanish black ensemble, appeared unapproachable, a figure of authority rather than comfort. This applied to both men and women. The very clothes they wore imposed a strict discipline on their bodies, mirroring the strict discipline of the court itself. Adornment when present was typically subtle but incredibly rich. Often garments were embellished with jet buttons, black pearls, or intricate embroidery in black silk or silver thread, creating a luxurious texture that was only visible upon closer inspection. White linen cuffs and ruffs, often starched to perfection, provided the only stark contrast to the overwhelming black, emphasizing the wearer's pristine cleanliness and wealth. The simplicity of the color allowed the intricate details of the fabric, the quality of the tailoring, and the exquisite lace to stand out. The psychological impact of this pervasive black was profound. It conveyed a sense of seriousness, piety, and an almost monastic devotion to duty. In a court where religious faith and dynastic continuity were paramount, this aesthetic resonated deeply. It suggested a rejection of frivolousness, an embrace of solemn purpose. For the Habsburgs, who saw themselves as defenders of Catholicism and universal monarchy, the Spanish black was a powerful visual manifesto. It created a unified, imposing front. A sea of dark, disciplined figures moving through the gilded palaces. This fashion was not just about clothes. It was about projecting an image of unshakable authority and an unyielding commitment to their divine right to rule. The constant physical constraint, the discomfort, the heat, all were part of the unspoken sacrifice required to embody the Habsburg ideal. While it might seem less outwardly ridiculous than a giant ruff or a massive wig, the total suppression of comfort and natural human movement for centuries, in pursuit of an aesthetic of rigid power and piety, reveals a deep, pervasive, and in its own way truly bizarre fashion philosophy that shaped the very lives of those who lived within the Habsburg orbit. Number 1. The sky-high absurdity of powdered wigs and hair towers move over modern hairspray attics. The 18th century Habsburg court, under the influence of its fashionable neighbors, especially the French, took hair to unimaginable, literally towering heights. This was the era of powdered wigs and extravagant hair constructions, a trend so extreme it defies belief in its sheer impracticality. Hygiene issues and undeniable visual absurdity. For both men and women, hair became an elaborate architectural project, designed to impress and astound. For men, the fashion dictated powdered perukes, often elaborate and formally styled. The simplest was the bob wig, but for court functions, men would often wear full-bottomed wigs that cascaded over their shoulders, or the slightly later queue. Wigs tied back with a black ribbon. These were not natural hair. They were meticulously crafted wigs made from human, horse, or goat hair. The powdered aspect came from the application of fine, scented powder, typically white or off-white, made from flour, starch, or even pulverized gypsum. This powder was dusted liberally over the wig, giving it a distinctive white or grayish sheen. The purpose was partly aesthetic, partly to absorb grease and odor, and partly to mask thinning hair or baldness. But it was the women's hair flaws that reached truly dizzying heights of ridiculousness. Starting from the 1770s, influenced by the court of Marie Antoinette in France, the fashion for women's hair escalated into monumental poufs, or hair towers. These were not just large hair lice. They were multi-tiered structures, built over padded frames, wire cages, or cushions called frisettes, then padded with false hair, and finally covered with the wearer's own hair, augmented by hair pieces. The entire edifice was then heavily powdered, often with scented and sometimes colored powders. The sheer scale of these creations was astounding. Some poufs could reach 2 or even 3 feet above the wearer's head. Imagine the weight of all that hair, padding, and powder. The neck muscles of noble women must have been incredibly strong to support such a load for hours on end. Empress Marie Therese's daughter, Marie Antoinette, may have been the most famous proponent of these styles, even incorporating miniature ships or elaborate scenes into her hair. But the trend certainly permeated the Austrian court. Among the high nobility, the practical challenges of living with such a hairstyle were immense. Sleeping was impossible without carefully propping the head or removing the hairpiece. Many women would go days, sometimes weeks, without fully dismantling their hair towers, leading to significant hygiene issues. The elaborate structures became breeding grounds for lice and other insects. Powder, while intended to mask odors, would mix with sweat and grease, creating a less than fresh aroma over time. Imagine the smell in a crowded ballroom filled with hundreds of these powdered, unwashed hair creations. Navigating doorways, carriages, and even sitting down became a spatial puzzle. Ladies had to duck or tilt their heads to avoid scraping their elaborate coiffures on doorframes. Special high-backed chairs, or even no-back stools, were sometimes necessary to accommodate the sheer height. Getting into and out of carriages was a delicate operation, often requiring the lady to sit on the floor of the carriage to avoid her head hitting the roof. Hats, when worn, had to be equally enormous and perched precariously on top of the already towering hair. The cost of these hairthols was exorbitant. Not only did they require vast quantities of powder, hairpieces, and ribbons, but they also demanded the services of highly skilled hairdressers, known as coiffeurs, who would spend hours constructing these elaborate edifices. These artists were paid handsomely for their architectural feats. The daily maintenance, the repowdering, and the occasional complete deconstruction and reconstruction represented a significant financial outlay and time commitment. Beyond the practicalities, the absurdity was evident. These hair tolls were not merely decorative, they were elaborate narratives, sometimes featuring miniature gardens, baskets of fruit, or even political statements rendered in hair and feathers. They were meant to draw attention, to showcase wealth, and the ability to indulge in such extravagant and utterly impractical display. The higher the hair, the higher the status. It was a clear, visible sign of a society preoccupied with superficial grandeur, pushing the boundaries of what could possibly be worn on one's head. The powdered wig and the hair tower, in their breathtaking scale and their blatant disregard for comfort or cleanliness, represent one of the most truly ridiculous yet undeniably iconic fashion trends to ever grace the halls of the Habsburg Empire.